I want to start off this morning talking a little bit about groceries. Now, as a kid, sometimes grocery shopping can be fun. Going with mom and dad, getting to pick out some special foods, especially if they're going to get you a treat and you can pick out your own cereal and whatnot. You know, that can be fun. But as you get older, it becomes more of a chore. And in this day and age, if you use an app as I do, it can become something challenging and difficult. I started with this new app that my uncle had told me about, and what it does is you scan the food before you buy it. It tells you how healthy or unhealthy it is at a score out of 100, whether it's red, yellow, or green, and then it'll tell you why. And you can tap on it and see what's in there, and you can look into those ingredients and the chemicals and additives, and and you can be like, whoa. And some of the things that I thought were healthy for me, they're like maybe a 15 out of 100. I'm like, what? This can't be right. It says real fruit. There's no way that's not real fruit. And those gummies and whatnot, How did it get like a 2 out of 100? Now, of course, I'm just joking there, but right, that's what marketing does. It's real fruit. It's organic. All these things that we're eating, and most of us, we know. We know that, a lot of it's marketing. It's been happening for a long time. Bianca's dad used to run a grocery store, and when Kraft singles were first introduced, they had them sitting out on the pallet and on the end, these new things. And they weren't selling that much until they got a memo from the head office, you need to put this in the cooler with the cheese. Because it didn't have to be refrigerated. And so they put it with the cheese and the sales went up. People thought, oh, this is a cheese. This is cheese. Or drumsticks. Many of you are aware, drumsticks are not ice cream. There's so many additives. And if you look online, there's people that are holding blowtorches to it and they do these comparisons and how it doesn't melt. There's too many additives. They call it a cold treat or something like that. And you look at the additives in there and many of the things we eat and we're like, this isn't so good for me. This is actually killing me. Actually, a lot of the foods that we're eating, and some of them in Canada are like, yeah, this is gonna weigh on our health care too much. We're not allowing these foods in Canada. And so a lot of the foods that we eat they're killing us. And yet we still do it. We know. And we call this guilty pleasure, right? We know it's not good for us, feels good, and I'm just going to buy just a little bit, and that's okay. So the problem that I have right now, the problem is not with us having our guilty pleasures and having your Timbits and things like that aren't good for you. The problem is that while we're eating our McDonald's French fries and hamburgers and have our guilty pleasures in front of us, we're pointing our fingers at other people that we just gave some money to them, and they went out and they wasted that money on, whatever. Maybe it's a 4x4 coffee that's terrible for them and they should have put that toward some milk and cereal. Or maybe they're wasting it on gambling, or maybe they're wasting it on cigarettes. We have our ideas of what they're wasting it on, and we fail to look at ourselves and ask, did I not just waste God's money? When I went and spent it on that guilty pleasure that's not doing any good for my body, it's actually killing my body, it's harming my body, and yet it's okay for me to do that, but if I give my money to someone else and they don't spend it in the way that I think they need to spend it, I'm not giving any more. And that's a real problem. I first encountered this when we were in Toronto. I had a couple of brothers visiting from another country, and we were in Toronto. I was showing them the CN Tower. We're looking around there at the waterfront, and there was someone asking for some money. And there's a fine line. Listen, I'm going to talk about that this morning. There's a fine line between enabling and whatnot. But this person, they had been out there. It was a hot day. I'm like, he's kind of working. He's pretty desperate, and he's just asking for a little bit. And if I leave today and I don't feed him, and this happened to be the last day that he had on earth because he didn't have enough food to survive, I wonder if God's going to say, Jamie, you walked right by that guy. By the way, here he is. He died, and you didn't help him. But if I gave him the money and he decides to take that money and use it on something else and waste it and not buy his food that day, and then he dies, well, that's on him. That was my thinking. And the problem is, one of these brothers turned to me, he said, "Brother, you gave that guy some money. Didn't you notice that there was some cigarette butts down below? He's probably going to go spend it on smoking, on some smokes." And I thought, well, again, if he does that and he dies, that's not on me. But if I don't give him that money, I wonder if, how God's going to look at that. So I started, this was back 20 years ago, when I started wrestling with this concept of, when are you enabling people? Should you give? And most of us, we have this real problem. So we just say, you know what? I'm not going to give, or I'll find, and if we're wise, we find different ways to give. But a lot of us, we back away. And we say, you know what? It's a difficult thing to do. And so, I think I'm not going to give as I should. The attitude that, and it's true, especially in this day and age, no matter how much you give, you're not going to solve the problem of having the poor. Back in Jesus' time, Jesus actually, when he was accused, or when Mary was accused, no, not Mary, the woman who was anointing Jesus' feet, it was Mary, and Judas, he accused her of wasting that money, that expensive perfume. And Jesus said there in Mark chapter 4, "You will always have the poor, and you can do what is good for them whenever you want, but you will not always have me." This statement, "you will always have the poor," this has been true since Jesus left the world. And even during that time, there's no way that Jesus physically helped every poor person on the world when he was on the earth. And so we can't solve the problem of giving to the poor, but yet God challenges us to give to the poor. So why? What is that accomplishing? And is it not just enabling? So my attitude has been what James says: judgment without mercy will be shown to the one who has not shown mercy. Mercy triumphs over judgment. We need to be merciful. And we need to remember to have a heart of compassion for people. Is this not what Jesus condemned the teachers of the law for? In Luke chapter 11, verse 37 to 43. Jesus is there and he's speaking, and a Pharisee asked him to dine with him, and so he went and reclined at the table. When the Pharisee saw this, he was amazed that he did not first perform the ritual washing before dinner. But the Lord said to him, "Now you Pharisees clean the outside of the cup and the dish, but the inside is full of greed and evil. Fools, didn't he who make the outside make the inside too? But give from what is within to the poor, and everything is clean for you." And then Jesus goes on to talk to them. He says, "But woe to you Pharisees," and this is known as the 6 woes. And then Jesus does this again to the Pharisees, and this is recorded in Matthew 23. It's called the 7 woes. Different times. But Jesus is condemning them. Because on the outside it looks good. "Woe to you Pharisees, you give a tenth of mint, rue, and every kind of herb, but you bypass justice and love for God. The things you should have done without neglecting the other." Jesus says, I see your heart. On the outside, you like to pretend that you're good, pretend that you're God's people, but you're not living it. And that can be our challenge. We're supposed to be the hands and feet of Jesus, but sometimes we don't do that. We do a poor job. And here, Jesus, he refers to the poor. Now, the poor come up quite a bit in Scripture. And I want to just talk a little bit about what Jesus taught on the poor and how Jesus wanted us to maybe view the poor. First of all, remember Jesus did teach on the poor. When he went and talked to Zacchaeus said, "Lord, look here now, I sell half my possessions, give to the poor." The rich young ruler, he says, "Sell everything, give to the poor, and come follow me." The poor comes up a number of times. And of course, in the parable of the Good Samaritan, someone who was in need and was helped, whether they were poor or not, but the person giving, the idea is they were to be giving. To the sheep and the goats, in Matthew 25, he said, sheep and the goats on either side during judgment. And he talks about whatever you did for the least of these, you did for me. There's an Old Testament proverb: whoever is kind to the poor lends to the Lord, and he will reward them for what they have done. It's not just Jesus who talked about the poor. This is all throughout the Scriptures and in the Old Testament. Jesus highlights the poor when he talks about the story of the rich man and Lazarus. When he talks about the widow, of all the people giving, he says, look at that. She's giving all she has. Jesus highlights and he points to the poor and how people usually treat them or don't, or not helping them, or how they don't treat them. Jesus acted toward the poor, and we know this. You know, I found something very interesting in the past couple of weeks. I never put the two together until a few weeks ago when I was reading the Bible with my youngest, and this passage popped out. Because remember when, again, Mary's anointing Jesus with that expensive perfume. And here's that situation. Here they are, and Judas, who was about to betray him, said, why wasn't the perfume sold for 300 denarii and given to the poor? And no one said, oh, why would we give to the poor? I mean, he's making an argument for himself. Why? John says he didn't care about the poor. Verse 6. He said this because he was a thief, and he was in charge of the money bag. He would steal what was put in it. See, Judas just wanted more money in the money bag, so he had more to steal. So he's thinking, and Judas was a cunning, clever guy. So Judas thinks, well, if I argue that the money should be given to the poor, maybe more of that will be put into the money bag. So it was a wise argument because that's what they did. Jesus and his disciples were known to give to the poor from the collection they made. And this is highlighted, and this is where it jumped out at me, in the next chapter. When Judas is about to betray Jesus, and Jesus said, the one who dips his hand with me, that's the one. And look what happened. Satan entered him, and said Judas ate the piece of bread after dipping it. Satan entered him, and Jesus said, what you're doing, do quickly. And the others are like, well, what's he talking about? What's he talking about? Some thought that maybe because he was in charge of the money bag, some thought that Jesus was telling them, get something for the festival, Passover. Or others thought maybe he was telling him to give something to the poor. Why would they even think? Why would they entertain this? We know it was the time of the festival. That's why they thought maybe it's about the festival. The next thing that came to their mind, maybe Jesus told them to go give something to the poor. Wasn't uncommon. That's what they did. Of all the money that they collected and the ministry that they had to do, they still found money to give to the poor. And so not only did Jesus teach on it, not only did he live it, and that's what they did, Jesus also came amongst the poor. He could have come in a palace. He came into this poor family, born into a manger, no room. And the first ones to come and see him were the shepherds out in the field who were the despised and didn't have a lot of money. He used commoners under the Roman tax system, these servants, these fishermen. And he taught them. He taught them about giving to the poor. The disciples and the apostles went on to talk about the poor. I want you to notice what Paul says. When Paul came to the apostles, he was given the right hand of fellowship and to him and Barnabas. And they agreed that they should go to the Gentiles. And then the only thing they asked, verse 10, they asked only that we would remember the poor, which I had made every effort to do. So when they're sent off on their mission trip, of all the things they could have been preparing for, I wonder when we're preparing and planning for missions, how many times in that course they have, a section on giving to the poor, taking care of the poor. This is a part of what the apostles understood from Jesus and passed that on. John goes on. If anyone has worldly goods and sees a fellow believer in need, we start with each other. That's important, starting with the church. We'll talk about that in a little bit. Where is God's love if you just say, go, I wish you well. That idea is James would talk about later on. And of course, in Acts chapter 2, all the believers had things in common. They sold their fields and they gave to those in need. People saw the church and they took care of each other, and especially the poor in the church were taken care of. And the people in the world look in and say, wow, I want to be a part of that. And of course, that's when we get to Ananias and Sapphira and people saying, ooh, this is a serious thing. Don't just join the church for the wrong reasons so that we can get food. God does want us to be taken care of, but he wants it to be done in the right way. There was also a collection that's given. The church took up a collection, and the church still does. And a part of the collection, that money goes towards all kinds of things, evangelism, but also for helping the poor. And under this congregation, there's so many asks and so many challenges. And under the guidance of the elders, the church will hand out and help out people as needed and as they see fit and wise. Paul says in 2 Corinthians, he says, the idea is not that you give everything so that now you become poor. That's not what giving's about. But there should be equality. In the church, you should look around and there should be equality, that there's not going to be exactly equality. And if we go back and you look at Barnabas, who was wealthy, and others, there's many situations. There are differences in the church, but people who have no food, people who have nothing, that's where the church steps in. They had a daily distribution of food to the widows. That's something the early church did. And the church still does take care of that. And of course, we have a social system that we're a part of as well. But the church should not say, this is not our problem, and just hand everyone over to the social system. This is first something that the church realizes, that it's God who provides for us. And this is what a reference here. When in the Old Testament they were picking manna, the person who was like, you know what, I'm a hard worker, I got some strength, I'm going to go out and I'm going to gather as much as I can and fill a barn full of manna. Do you know what happened to that manna? It only lasted that day and it would go rotten after one day. You could store all you wanted. You could build a whole complex of barns and store all the manna you wanted, be as hard a worker as you wanted, and it would all go rotten the next day. And the person who was weak and couldn't gather as much and didn't have enough strength, they gathered manna and it was just enough for them. And the idea is that God is taking care of us and God uses us. The 10th, giving of tithing, giving of a tenth. Someone brought that up a couple of Wednesdays ago, and I was reminded, which is very interesting. It's not just something that's in the law. This is actually something that people had in their hearts before the law. When Abraham meets Melchizedek, he gives a tenth. Where'd that idea come from? That's before the law. And Jacob, when, at Bethel, the angels are ascending and descending, and he's amazed at that place, and he commits to give a tenth. Where did that come from? This idea of sacrifice and giving goes way back. God communicated with people. God wanted his people to be giving. And so we are a people who are a giving people. Of course, in the law, God warns them, if they're poor among you, don't be tight-fisted toward your poor brother or hard-hearted. And there is a lot of good givers that I know, and I don't know what people give, and many of you don't know what each other gives. You know yourself. But I know it must be hard for some that are giving. When someone gives and they're working so hard, and I know some, they work so hard, they save up on everything. And they'll save up some money, and they won't even buy coffee at Tim Hortons because they're wise with their money, and they'll give that money to someone else, and someone else will come in, maybe that they had given money to, and that person's got a Tim Hortons. And the person who gave them that money, they're happy that they're giving, God has blessed them. That's how it works. We got to be careful in how we judge. Because maybe that person who got that Tim Hortons, maybe that's the only pleasure, the only enjoyment they get all week. And you know what? We're not the judge, and it's God who gives, and we waste God's money all the time. We waste God's money on things. As we point fingers, there's that when you point a finger, there's three pointing back at you. That idea that take the plank out of your own eye before you take the speck out of someone else's. We have a real challenge when it comes to giving, and a lot of people say, I'm not giving anymore because I don't like the way that my money's being spent. It's not our money to begin with. It's God who gives, and if you think I've earned it all on my own and you're hard worker, good, and that God gave you those skills and abilities, you put it to good use, God will bless you for that use. But don't think that it's yours, because everything we have is a gift from God. The challenge we have with judging, we look in the Old Testament, don't go to the edge of your field. I mean, God's been telling us to give right from the Old Testament. Jesus set that example and showed us, and we have a real problem when it comes to judging. Some people are poor because they are lazy. Some people are poor because they make bad decisions. Some people are poor because, they're foolish with their money. But there are a lot of people that are poor, it's not their fault. There are some people who are poor because no one taught them how to use their money wisely, because their parents died when they were younger, or they had to leave everything to come to another country and start fresh, and they lost everything. Someone stole from them. There's different reasons people are poor. Maybe someone lacks the abilities. They weren't born with the right cognitive abilities or physical abilities, and they don't have the right opportunities. They're born in a different place where there's no opportunity. There's different reasons, and God knows all those reasons. And we happen to be born in a wealthy country, in a wealthy time, and we have much to give. But when we're pointing our fingers at others, we need to be careful. Some people don't have the skills. Some people, maybe they don't have the right persona. They have bad manners. Maybe it's past trauma. We're learning a lot about trauma. Maybe it's past trauma that's come out in their life, and that's put them into a life of wasting their money on pleasures that help them, forget. Everyone's different, and God knows it. And we're not justifying wasting God's money. But what can we do? We got to be careful how we judge. We can help people. We recognize three things. First, we have to have a better attitude on giving. And so, be willing to give. When we give as a church, and we have a collection, we could do much more together. But we also give individually and make those decisions individually to give. So we have to have a better attitude on giving. And remember, God's the one we do it for. Paul says, here's an example of that church collection and church giving to the widows. The other thing we can do is take our responsibility well for those in our circles. We can help those out before they become poor. We can help them out, do the right things, and not put burdens on the church. And if we have someone who is genuinely in need that we are to be caring for, we should be taking up and caring for them and not putting that on the church. And that's what Paul says. If anyone who has children or grandchildren, let them learn to practice godliness toward their own family, to repay their parents, for this pleases God. The widow who is truly in need and left all alone has no family. She puts her hope in God and continues night and day in her petitions and prayer, and that's the church would help them. And that's God blessing them through his people. We can build a relationship with those people who need help and teach them. Teach them that, to work. The thief, instead of stealing, to do honest work. Why? So that you have something to share with anyone. So change your attitude in giving and change your attitude in work. As Christians, we should be like, I don't mind going to work. And it's not so I can be, I can be someone, and accumulate all this for myself. Even if you have it, I'm helping others. It's my way to go and to be a blessing and help others. And that's the attitude Paul's telling us, because we know that Paul also said, if someone won't work, they won't eat. This idea that we should be working, and work isn't an evil thing, because we can work and help others. And then finally, change our attitude for what we want and need. There are a lot of things that we think we need that actually we just want. And a lot of times in life as we get older, we look at all the stuff that we've accumulated. I'm bad for this too. And I'm like, I shouldn't have bought that. I didn't use that all these 10 years. So many things that we don't actually need. And so we remember godliness with contentment is great gain. We brought nothing into the world, and you can take nothing out of it. You can't bring anything with you. Keep your life free from the love of money. Be satisfied with what you have. And remember, it's God who is our helper. And he will bless us in the end. Give abundantly. Remember, Jesus taught us God loves a cheerful giver. Remember the poor, change our attitude. Spend time with them, helping them, teaching them, loving them. And the greatest things we can give them is not just financially, but we give them our compassion, our mercy, our forgiveness, and the love of God. May God help us to continue the mission of giving to the poor as Jesus taught us, because Jesus is still here giving to the poor through us, his people, as we are his hands and feet, and he is the head of his church. May we be givers to the glory of God. Let's stand for our final hymn.